Alright, welcome to the lesson on Age and Cohort. So, another way that we are differentiated in society is by our age group. Of course, belonging to different age groups has different responsibilities, different requirements. Children don't have the same requirements as people in the workforce, for example. So we're going to take a little look here at how age affects how we see the world, and then sort of adds to the diversity that we see within our society. So, first, in the United States, of course, one of the adages is really don't get old. We live in a society that tells us that we should be young, stay young. Youth has become extremely socially desirable in our society. You see it with the increase in plastic surgery and those sort of things. But we want to reach adult age, but then it seems like people want to sort of stop any growth at that point. So this is one of those sort of ideas that starts to come up and tells us a lot about the values and the beliefs that exist in our society. So I'm just going to hit you with some terms here, just some basics here. Ageism is something, of course, that we see. Ageism is prejudice and discrimination against the elderly. We, of course, see a fair amount of this, for example, in the workplace. It is very difficult for people, once you get to a certain age, to find employment. Employers are less likely to hire people who are older. They're less likely to see the positives, perhaps, of the experience they bring to the workforce, and more likely to see some perceived negatives. It could be something as simple as insurance costs or something, but just something to sort of think about. There's a lot of opportunities, by the way, for those of you in the United States in this field, because we have an aging population in the United States. A lot of this is related to the baby boom generation, that generation after really World War II, and we see so many young children being born at that time, and these are now people who are entering retirement age and are retiring. And so when we talk about this from the medical side, you'll see the term geriatrics used, which is the medical specialty that focuses on diseases and disabilities that are related to aging. And then more on the sort of broad side, everything sort of falls under gerontology, which we do offer a certificate program here at Stark State if you're interested, which is a focus on the study of aging. I always tell people in class, and I'll just give you a short little sort of mention here, if you are going into something, healthcare related field or some of these other ones I'll show you, it's not a bad idea to take some classes related to gerontology. It may be something that makes you more marketable in the job market, and especially if it's something you're interested in, there's certainly going to be a lot of jobs for people working with the elderly. I'll throw just a couple of them on here just so you can see them. There's definitely increasing demand for jobs in healthcare, of course, which is the one most people think about. Social workers as well, financial planners, fitness trainers, home healthcare aides, aging in place and home modification professionals. That's more on the construction side. How do you make homes accessible to people as they start to have mobility disabilities, for example? Dietitian and nutritionists, and recreational therapists. So if any of these are fields that you're interested in, you'll probably find good growth within these fields, certainly if you're looking at working with an elderly population. So just something to think about if any of you are interested in that sort of this sort of field. Okay, so when we talk about age, we oftentimes talk about age grades and age sets. Now, an age grade are the certain age categories or phases that we all go through. So what I mean here is that we all sort of pass through the same stages throughout the periods of our lives. So we start at, of course, infancy, we enter childhood, then we enter adolescence, and of course these other stages, middle age, retirement ages. There's these certain ages that have certain requirements that are associated with them. So, for example, when someone's in their childhood, that's expected that they're going to be in school. When someone's of work age, it's expected they're going to be in the workforce generally. That's what I mean by age grades. On the other hand, In age grades, of course, you rotate through these throughout your life period, so you go through different age grades. On the other hand, there's an age set, and your age set is stable. And what we mean by age set is what generation do you belong to? What generation were you born into? And so here's a couple of them that are on here. For example, the baby boomers that I mentioned, the age group of people who are starting to retire here. And those are people born between 46 and 64, thereabouts. That's 1946, of course, right at the end of World War II. Generation X is those people born between 61 and 75. Notice overlap. I know they're not perfect dates. And Generation Y is generally seen as somewhere between 1976 and 1994. Now, what's important about these is that belonging to an age set also, in general, is related to certain attitudes or ideas based upon the sort of generation you grew up in, right? We all grew up in different times. We're impacted by different things that occurred to us during those periods of lives, especially during those formative years when we were children. So, does it matter? Well, of course it matters, because when you start looking at the attitudes of people who belong to different generations, you're going to find different things. So here's just a quick one that looks at different generations, and for example, how much activities do they do on their cell phones. And you can see, of course, send or receive text messages, and if you look at different age groups, you see that there's a fair difference between the amount of technology one is using based upon the generation you're born into. So, of course, for those of you born in Generation Y, you through at least through your teenage years and on have been around these technologies that are, for many people, was something certainly that they would not have been around growing up. So there's sort of this adaptation that's occurred. So now, of course, if you see young children, it's not unusual to see kids who are 4, 5, 6 who have, cell phones and iPods and iPads. They're going to be very technologically savvy as they grow up, and so, of course, they'll be quick to adopt new technologies because that's sort of how they've been trained. And that, of course, differs based upon the generation you're in. So we see all kind of different attitudes that develop based upon the generation we belong to. So there's a lot of this in the textbook that you can take a look at, and I do want you to look at that. I'm not going to go through each of the generations, but think about how these generations differ and how they see the world, their attitudes towards the world. For example, their attitudes towards work and home life and those sort of things. And there are sort of differences that we can look at. They're generalized differences. They're not true for every single person, but they're generalized differences related to these groups that we belong to. One thing that we've seen, of course, is that the population inside the United States is aging, and that's going to have some big impacts on some of those choices. For example, the job markets are a lot of times going to be determined by this. That is, what types of jobs are available. One thing that we've seen, and is I guess a little meme here that kind of brings it home, but one thing that we've seen is there's become substantial segregation between people as they age. And one of the things that has been true, certainly for the past few decades, is that people as they get older tend to move to certain locations. Those locations tend to be in the South. They tend to be warmer locations, so locations like Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. So in those states, for example, you're going to have a much higher percentage of people over the age of 65. One thing that's also related to age is this notion of intergenerational conflict. And I don't mean sort of any physical conflict or anything, but with the demographics of the United States changing, we see really two trends going on here. When we look at the youngest people in the United States, we see a lot more diversity. That is, the age group of people who are most likely to be diverse are those under 18. We see a lot more diversity in those under 18 than in any other group. On the contrary, when we look at people who are over the age of 65, that tends to be a much whiter population. Now, a lot of this, remember, has to do with population trends and how they've changed over time. I mentioned, of course, a while back, a few chapters back, that immigration trends have really changed in the United States. Most of our immigration now is coming from places like Central and South America and Asia. It's not the traditional white population that we saw immigrating from Europe in the 1800s. So the elderly population is more likely to sort of reflect the United States that existed years ago, as opposed to what we see amongst the youthful population, which sort of represents the United States of the future. And so this can lead to conflict, and what we're talking about here is conflict over resources. And this has to do with attitude differences between those generations. So let's take a look here. For example, at the nation's race and ethnicity. So I already put those numbers up there, but you get to see when we start looking at the younger the population is, it becomes much more diverse of groups other than white, and the older the population is, the more likely it is to be white. And this does have an impact. It has an impact because those generations do matter on overall attitudes. So if we take a look here at ideology by generation, for example. So if we look at the percent of people who define themselves as conservative, and we look at the percent of people that define themselves as liberal, what you notice here is that depending on the generation you belong to, it's going to impact, in general, how conservative or liberal you are. So you may have heard people say that the older one is, the more likely you are to be conservative. It is actually bared out by our data. So if you look at this, the older generations are more likely to be conservative than the younger generations. So people tend to get a little more conservative over time. That means different attitudes as far as on a whole host of issues, social issues, as well as political attitudes and those sort of things. On the other hand, if we look at percent liberal, it's an absolute reverse of that. People who are younger are more likely to be liberal than people who are older. So there's some attitude differences that play into how age interacts with the diversity we see in society. So that's about it for this Age and Cohort. There's, of course, a lot more material, and as always, make sure you're reading the chapter, and make sure that you are looking at all the materials in the materials folder and getting those assignments done. So once again, have a great week out there. We're definitely getting close to the end now, so be sure you're getting everything done, and I'll see you around.